All right, we begin this hour with breaking news out of Capitol Hill, where just in the last couple of minutes, NBC News has learned the House Ethics Committee plans to release its report into now former Congressman Matt Gaetz. Joining us now, NBC's Ryan Nobles and Ali Vitale, both on Capitol Hill, and Brendan Buck, former press secretary to former House Speakers Boehner and Ryan. He is also an MSNBC political analyst. So let's start right, Ryan, with what we know about this committee plans to release this report.
Yeah, Jose, this is quite a bit of an about-face by the House Ethics Committee, which has wrestled with this question about whether or not it was appropriate for them to release this report into former Congressman Matt Gaetz, even though he was no longer a member of the body in which they have jurisdiction. And of course, comes after the committee, which had been working on this report for several years, was getting prepared to release this report at the end of the year. But then we're thrown a curveball when Gaetz was named as Donald Trump's pick to become the next attorney general. Gaetz then subsequently resigned from Congress, leaving the Ethics Committee in a bit of limbo. While there is some precedent for the Ethics Committee to release report of former members, that's generally not their policy, and it's something that they don't do very often. There was a push and pull between Republicans and Democrats on the panel. The House Speaker, Mike Johnson, got involved, said that he believed that it was not appropriate for them to release this report. But then as Gaetz began his process through the confirmation on the Senate side, Republican senators made it very clear that they wanted to see this report before making a decision as to whether or not they were going to vote yes or no on his confirmation. Gaetz then took the story in another turn by pulling himself out of the running for Attorney General and then making it clear he would not return to Congress even though he had won re-election, and the Ethics Committee was left with a decision to make. Initially, they had a meeting, decided they weren't prepared to release the report. That forced the hand of some Democrats in Congress who put a resolution on the floor for the whole House to vote on whether or not they should release the report. Republicans voted to refer that back to the Ethics Committee. And now we're learning today that when the Ethics Committee last met, they made the formal and final decision to release the report. Jose, we expect the report to be released sometime at the end of this week after they finish all the other business that needs to be done before they leave on their holiday break. We will finally see the results of this exhaustive report that the House Ethics Committee has on former Congressman Matt Gaetz.
Ali, any reaction or any word from the former congressman?
Certainly, Jose. We've seen Gaetz, and one of his central premises in the tweet that he sent out was that he doesn't have a chance to debate or rebut the things that are going to be in this report that we can now say will be released at some point in the near future. But part of what Gaetz says in a very lengthy statement posted to social media was that he has been investigated before. Certainly that's true, including by the Ethics Committee. This has been an on and off investigation into various ethical quandaries that the committee has ultimately not pursued. But he writes in part, this is from Gaetz, "I was charged with nothing, fully exonerated, not even a campaign finance violation, and the people investigating me hated me." He then goes on at a later point to talk about, quote, "In my single days, I often sent funds to women I dated. I never had sexual contact with someone under 18, he writes, and he says any claim that I would be destroyed in court, which is why no such claim was ever made. He then goes on to make a point at the end that while it's embarrassing in his words, but not criminal, that he, in his words, probably partied, womanized, drank, and smoked more than I ever should earlier in life. I live a different life now. And then he ends with a point about never voting for continuing resolutions, which, of course, brings us nice back to a bookend of what Congress's actual business before the end of the year should be, which is keeping the lights on and funding the government. But certainly for Gaetz, a robust rebuttal online and the fact that this report now could come out. And I do think it's important for us to continue to underscore, Ryan laid out so well the landscape here on Capitol Hill and the back and forth push and pull over whether or not to release a report about a member who is no longer a member. He's right to point out that there's precedent for that. But I also think we have gotten rare views, sometimes to the chagrin of members on the Ethics Committee, who all take a vow not to leak, not to talk about what happens behind closed doors in their meetings. This is really one of the last committees that has that air of traditionalism to it. The idea that what happens in the room stays in the room. We don't often get insight into the decisions that ethics has made, what investigations they are pursuing, until they actually decide to release it and say so themselves. And so the fact that we have gotten these rare glimpses of transparency into how this process is working just goes to show, the volatility of Matt Gaetz as a former member of this body, but then also the scrutiny that is being put on these typically traditional bipartisan parts of Congress that are still left as rare vestiges here in this building, and the ways that those ends have kind of frayed during this process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fact, Ali, that is it not, that there have been no leaks or very little leaks about this or any other investigation from within that committee.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we're even watching Congresswoman Susan Wild, who is the Democratic ranking member of that committee, face allegations from other members that she somehow basically colored outside the lines of the rules of that committee to not talk about what has happened in the room. What they're pointing to when they say that is the idea that when the chairman of the committee, Michael Guest, came out and said we were inconclusive in our vote, we didn't know either way whether we were going to release it or whether all of us were unanimous not going to release it. They were deadlocked, if you remember, a few weeks ago. Susan Wild made the point to come out and say, hey, I just want to make sure that everyone understands deadlock doesn't mean that everyone on the committee agreed not to release the report. So even just having that kind of a conversation about the outgrowth of the process can be seen by some members as members breaking the code of silence that this committee still very much has around it.
And so, Brennan, first of all, how unusual, and, I know we've been talking about it, and Ryan's certainly been mentioning that it's not something we commonly see, but how unusual really is it for a report to be released, especially after the member of Congress is no longer a member of Congress?
Yeah, quite rare. I guess there is some precedent to it. And one of the things I'm curious about is, will we get an explanation for the rationale at all? As Ali laid out, this is not a committee that holds open hearings, and you don't often hear why they're doing what they're doing. And we're sort of left to speculate what their motivations are. And I think there could be a few things. Yes, he has resigned, but he has also been elected to serve the next Congress, which starts in a few weeks. Now, he said he's not going to take that seat, but they may see that as a reason why this should be released, just maybe as a buffer for that. The other thing, and building off of what Ali said, it does operate in secrecy, but it is also considers itself fiercely independent. Most committees of the House are in some way an extension of the parties or an extension of the leadership. The House Ethics Committee feels that it is an independent body that should not have any political sway. And I do wonder, at one point when Mike Johnson went publicly and tried to sort of encourage or direct the Ethics Committee to not release this, if that was in some ways a mistake, if members of that committee feel like they are put in the position now of either having to look like they were carrying the water of the speaker rather than doing what they wanted to do. And I wonder if those members said, look, we can't allow that to be the impression of how the House Ethics Committee works, that Mike Johnson has told us not to release it, so we will now not release it. And then the other potential motivation for releasing this is maybe the most simple one. A lot of people really don't like Matt Gaetz, and he probably was not a very easy person for them to work with and probably made a lot of enemies in that room throughout the process. And he has attacked that panel very publicly for the way that they've handled this. And I think they probably feel like they need to speak on their own behalf to put out their side of the story of what is really going on here. Now, this process is probably interesting, sort of inside baseball stuff. I think the most important thing is we're going to learn a lot more about Matt Gaetz, who still has, I think, a lot of ambition going forward. He's been rumored to be interested in running for governor down the line. And I think this could be a really, obviously, a watershed moment here for the public understanding of who this person really is.
And talking about that investigative committee, Brendan, what are the tools that committee has in its arsenal to investigate? In other words, to what level, to what degree can they investigate issues that in the Gaetz specific case go into some very personal moments?
Yeah, I mean, really anything that would call into the question the honor of the House is anything that is in the realm of what they can look into. And certainly personal let's keep in mind, there are some things here that were allegations made against him that would potentially be criminal. And he's talked about that. So certainly any criminal action, but also campaign finance violations. But they have a pretty broad mandate of things that could cast dishonor on the House to look into. And this is a very a panel that goes to great length and is very deliberate. They have a lot of investigators, a lot of serious professional staff who take this very seriously. To be under investigation by the House Ethics Committee is no small thing. This is not just, hey, come down and talk to a couple members of Congress and we'll ask you a few questions. They have serious lawyers and investigators who are going to go into this, and anybody who's been caught up in this can find it to be extremely disruptive to their being in the House. So I would expect that this to be a relatively thorough report. They've been working on it for a very long time, and I imagine we'll get a lot of significant detail, and we'll have a lot more questions even to ask after we see it.